Welcome back to Chronicles of the Old West. By the summer of 1876, the Lakota and their allies had gathered in force along the Greasy Grass. The winds carried tension. The drums echoed deeper. And in the heart of it all stood Gall, a warrior shaped by hardship, sharpened by purpose. But before the famous battles, before the names etched themselves into history, came a moment that would change everything. This is episode 4 of our series on Gall, Lakota War Chief.
I am the voice of a memory, of wind through pine, of drumbeat and dust. I speak now of a time before fences, before the Black Hills echoed with the ring of axes and the groan of wagons. This is the story of a man whose eyes burned with sorrow and flame, whose path led through blood and broken promises. He was known among his people as Pizi, but the white men called him Gall. This part of his story begins not in battle, but in betrayal. In the moon of the red cherries, the year 1874, yellow-haired Custer rode into the Black Hills. His orders said, "Scout for an army post." But in the hearts of his men, and deeper still in the minds of those who sent them, there was gold. Gold buried in the bones of the hills, shimmering beneath the sacred ground of the Lakota. This land, the Paha Sapa, had been promised to the people in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. It was written, signed, spoken, aloud. No white man shall enter, but gold turns the hearts of men. Custer found what he sought, or claimed to. His words spread like fire. Reports spoke of glittering veins, endless riches. Never mind that the geologist Winchell found little more than dust. The truth mattered less than the dream. And in the shadow of the panic of 1873, that dream was irresistible. Miners swarmed like locusts, 12,000 strong by 1876, trampling treaty and land alike. President Grant, once a soldier who knew war, tried first to honor the words on paper, but his hands were weak, and the pressure of the gold-hungry tide too strong. Soldiers looked the other way, and the Lakota watched, anger rising like the river in spring. Gall was not the first to speak, nor the one most eagerly heard when the campfires crackled and the elders leaned in close. That place belonged to Sitting Bull, the holy man, whose words moved like wind through cottonwoods, brushing against something deeper than thought. And it was Crazy Horse who stirred the younger warriors, his silence louder than shouting, his lance quick and sure as winter ice. But Gall was different. He was not a man of omens or riddles, not carved from legend or born on the wings of dreams. He was a man of muscle, of morning frost, of buffalo robes and worn leather. His strength announced itself. It was in the way he stood, the way his eyes weighed a man, steady and without haste. When he spoke, it was plain and final. He hunted for his people, rode against the Crows in the old ways, took honors, led war parties with measured fire. He saw what was coming, not as a prophet sees, with visions and thunder in the sky, but as a man who watches tracks in the snow and knows what beast made them. The signs were there. Too many strangers heading west, their wagons heavy, their eyes fixed on what lay beneath it. Gold, always gold. And with it, the slow grinding of treaties under the boots of men who had never signed them. Still, the Lakota did not rise in haste. Their anger was not yet kindled into war. They moved as they had always moved, against old enemies, on trails worn by generations. The Crows still held their attention, and the warfare remained what it had long been, a measure of manhood, of daring, of honor, taken without death when possible. Horses were stolen in the night, and coups were counted with swift touches and swift escapes. But something had shifted. The wind carried unease. Raids into the Gallatin Valley were no longer games of honor. Blood was spilled, and it soaked into soil claimed by settlers who saw only savagery. Those settlers cried out for vengeance. And far away, behind walls and desks, men in uniform and suits answered. They spoke in orders, and the army began to sharpen its blade for pursuit. Gall watched all this with a warrior's eye and a hunter's patience. He understood what the others were only beginning to see. The old wars were ending. A new kind of war was coming, one without honor, without rules, and without mercy. But it did not come the way word should come to a people. It did not come from a council fire. It was not brought by a friend or a scout or even an interpreter we knew. It came in the way of the Wasatchew, through paper, stamped and signed in the east, where the great houses rise from stone and smoke. There were no drums in its delivery, no voices raised in understanding, only silence and something written in a language many of our people could not read. It was called an ultimatum. That is a hard word, one with sharp corners. It said that all the Indian bands not living on the Great Sioux Reservation must go there by the end of the moon, or they would be treated as enemies of the United States. That is what the paper said. But to our people, it made no sense. There had been no council, no smoke shared, no chiefs called to speak. The Wasatchew had made a decision, far away, and the wind carried its weight westward. But the wind does not speak Lakota, and neither did that paper. The date they gave came and passed. The snows lay heavy on the trails. The buffalo had gone where they always go when the cold comes, south and east, and our hunters had followed, for that was the way of life. You cannot leave your food behind to walk into the unknown. The people were spread across the Powder River country then, small bands with their fires, tucked into coulees and breaks, sheltered where they could. You could look out over that land in those days and see nothing but white and sky, and the thin smoke of life curling into the cold air. Many had never been to the agency. They knew only what they had heard, that the beef was thin, that the promises were thinner, that once you went in, you might never come out. Some who had gone returned with stories of hunger, of fences, of being told when and where to walk, to speak, to hunt. That was not the Lakota way. It was not freedom. No, the people did not ignore the words from Washington. They heard them in their own way. Some did not understand. The words were strange, distant, carved out of a world that had no lodgepoles, no drumming, no stars to guide by. And others, like Gall, understood all too well. They knew this was not just another demand. It was a beginning, a drawing of lines, a message not of peace, but of hunger, hunger for land, for gold, for power. And they made their decision. They stayed. Not because they were reckless, not because they wished for war, but because there are some things a man cannot walk away from, his people, his way of life, the truth of who he is. And so they remained, even as the snow deepened, even as the threat grew. And so war came. General George Crook, a lean man with a beard like a thicket and a face weathered by campaigns in the West, assembled his forces at Fort Fetterman. He was no stranger to Indian fighting, and he knew the harsh mathematics of winter war. If you struck in the cold, when lodges were banked in snow and ponies were weak from grazing on brush, you might break the spirit of a people before the spring grass ever came. On March 1st, 1876, Crook moved north with more than 1,000 men, infantry, cavalry, and pack trains slogging through snowdrifts. The march was slow and brutal. Boots cracked in the frost. Horses stumbled on ice. Men muttered through scarves and pulled coats tighter, but they kept moving toward a place where warriors still lived free. 17 days later, Crook sent Colonel Joseph Reynolds ahead with a detachment. The scouts, Crow and Shoshone allies, had found a village along the Powder River. It was mostly Cheyenne, but some Lakota were there too. Families, elders, women and children among the teepees. A winter camp, not a war party. At first light on March 17th, Reynolds struck. Gunfire cracked across the snowy plain. Smoke rose, dark and wild against the pale sky. Soldiers surged into the camp, expecting panic, expecting surrender. Instead, they found resistance. The first shots took lives, yes, but then the warriors rallied. From behind lodge poles and willow brush, from snowbanks and ravines, they fired back. They knew this land. They knew how to fight in it. Reynolds faltered. The soldiers, caught between the rising defense and the freezing cold, began to retreat. Ammunition wagons were left behind. Supplies, too. They set fire to some of the lodges and fled southward, carrying their wounded and dead. It was not a victory. It was a blow struck in haste, followed by confusion and withdrawal. The Cheyenne and Lakota buried their dead. Then they moved north, toward Crazy Horse, toward Sitting Bull, toward others who would soon understand that the war had begun, and it would not be fought on their terms. Colonel Reynolds returned to Fort Fetterman under a sky the color of gray, his column trailing the smoke of regret. The fire in the Powder River camps had gone out, but the sting of the failed assault lingered in every bootstep. His soldiers, worn by cold and shame, spoke in low tones of what had happened. They did not speak of victory. They spoke of confusion, of poor judgment, of a retreat that felt too much like flight. In time, Reynolds would face a court-martial. The army needed someone to blame. But in the north, where the winds carried news faster than any telegraph, the meaning of the battle was different. For the northern Cheyennes, it had been more than defense. It had been revelation. The soldiers had come in winter when the camp was unprepared, and yet they had not broken them. Families had fled through the snow. Warriors had turned the tide. The memory of that day would not be one of defeat, but of awakening. Those who had survived, the women who had carried children through drifts, the old men who had leaned on the young to keep pace, made their way to Crazy Horse's village. The Oglala war leader, already known for his quiet resolve and the fierce clarity of his mind, welcomed them. He did not speak of vengeance. He spoke of gathering. That winter, his camp moved to the north and east, toward the lands near the chalk bluffs, where the Hunkpapa had made their lodges. There, Sitting Bull waited. His voice carried weight, not just for the Lakota, but for the Cheyenne, the Sans Arc, the Miniconjou, the Sante, the Brule. He spoke of the old ways, of the need to stand together, not as scattered bands, but as one people. The Powder River fight had shown the cost of isolation. Now, lodges were struck and moved, as if by unseen signal. Teepees rose beside each other in the valleys, painted hides and family marks standing side by side. Children chased dogs through new paths. Drummers found their rhythms. Fires burned longer at night. The old rivalries faded. There was little talk now of which band had the best hunters or the strongest medicine. The army had made them related through danger. And then came the vision. When the moon of the green grass came again, the people gathered near the banks of the Rosebud. The wind still carried the cold from the high places, but the earth was waking, and with it, the hearts of our warriors. It was there that the Hunkpapa leader, Sitting Bull, called for a sun dance. The drums began before the sun set, and they did not stop through the night. They pounded like the sound of many hooves on hard ground, like a heartbeat calling the spirits down from the star country. Sitting Bull went into the center. He danced and he sang, and he cried out to Wakantanka. For 4 days he fasted. For 4 nights he slept not at all. His body swayed beneath the sun, and when he was weak with hunger, he took the knife and offered his flesh. Strips were cut from his arms and held up to the sky so the spirits might take them and answer. Sitting Bull saw soldiers falling upside down into the Lakota camp. He told the people they dropped like rain, head first, helpless. This was no dream. It was a vision, and visions are gifts. The old men nodded. The women prayed. The warriors looked to their ponies, and their eyes were bright. They knew then the time was near. Then, one morning, as mist still lay low on the grass, the Cheyenne scouts rode in from the south. Their horses were tired. Their mouths were tight with news. A large army comes, they said. That morning came like any other, with the light creeping over the ridges and the dew still soft on the grass. It was the moon of making fat, the 17th day. Some call it June in the white man's way. The place was the valley of the Rosebud, where the river bends and sings to the stones. That day it ran red. The bluecoat soldiers, under the one called Crook, marched into the valley like men walking into a dream. They thought it was just another day. But the warriors were waiting, Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, all with the fire in their blood and the earth beneath their ponies' hooves. They had heard Sitting Bull's vision. They had felt the wind shift. When the first shots rang out, it was like thunder breaking open the sky. The air filled with smoke and shouting, with the cries of horses and the bark of rifles. Our warriors struck with the fury of those who have nothing left to give but their breath. They rode in waves like water from a broken dam, one group riding in, another pulling back to rest, always fresh warriors at the front. The ground shook. For 6 hours, it shook. There were women in that fight, too. They did not stay behind. They moved through the smoke, carrying water in bowls and hides, pulling the wounded from the dust, shouting to keep their hearts strong. They were warriors in spirit, and that spirit fed the fire. And what of Gall? Of Pizi? Some say he was there, that he rode beside Crazy Horse, his war club rising and falling like a hawk striking from the sky. Others say he waited, watching from another place. I do not know where his feet stood that day, but his spirit was there, in the strength of the warriors, in the cries of the children hidden in the grass, in the will of the people who would not break. When the smoke lifted and the guns went quiet, the bluecoats were still alive, but they were not the same. Crook turned back. He did not push forward to join Custer, and because of that, all the world changed. The people had won a great fight, but it was only the beginning, like the first crack of ice before the river breaks loose. The great village began to move, thousands of teepees now, drawn west like birds before a storm. They rode toward the Little Bighorn. This was the road to war. It was a road walked by men like Crook and Custer, and answered by men like Gall. He did not always speak first. He did not wear feathers to draw the eye. But when he stood, others stood with him. When he took up his weapon, others followed. I am old now. The lines on my face are the years, and in each one lives the name of someone who walked the old road before us. These stories were given to me by men who had sat with their backs to the fire, faces to the wind, eyes filled with things too heavy to carry alone. Gall has always been my favorite, the hard one, the iron bison of our people. I have spoken of how he rose, how he found his place among the brave. But now I must speak of another thing, of the day when the earth swallowed his joy. These words I give you are not only for the ears, but for the heart, for you must listen as if you too have sat beside the fire and felt the wind shift with news of death. The sun had not yet climbed when the camp stirred. The ponies, restless and hungry, chewed at the grass that still clung to the banks of the Greasy Grass. The village had become great. Now thousands of people moved like waves on the land. After the Rosebud fight, the warriors walked taller and the women sang louder. Even those from the agencies who had known the white man's bread and annuities returned to stand again with the people. It was a good time, though the grass thinned beneath the herds and the game fled before the thunder of our numbers. The Cheyennes led the move north along the Greasy Grass. Behind them came the Brule, the Oglala, Crazy Horse walking silent and watching, the Sans Arc, the Miniconjou, and then the Hunkpapa, proud and fierce at the rear, as is right for those who guard the sacred trail. Gall rode with them, his face firm as the ridge stone. They camped in the timber near a place where the hills watched close. It was a Sunday, though such names meant little to us. The day was calm. The horses grazed again, and the women cooked. Some boys ran down among the trees to play. They could be heard laughing, chasing sticks as if they were spears. They were the first to see the dust. Their cries were like the cry of a hawk before the rabbit is taken. But by then, the rabbit is already dead. Scouts rode ahead, Arikara and Crow, traitors. One among them was Bloody Knife, whom Gall hated with a fury. Those scouts did not charge in like men. No war cry, no honor in the open. They came as shadows, creeping low through the cottonwoods and the tall grass where the birds had gone silent and the wind held its breath. The sun was high, but under the trees it felt dim, like dusk. Their horses were tethered behind them, muzzles wrapped to keep them quiet. The scouts' faces were streaked with dust and sweat, their rifles cradled in their arms like sleeping infants. They moved slow, with hunger in their eyes, for killing. They came to the edge of the village, where the willow thinned and the river widened like a mouth. There, among the cattails and stones, were women and children. They had come for water, or were just returning from the trees, unaware of what crept toward them. The scouts crouched low. Not a word was spoken, only the click of a hammer pulled back. Through the gaps in the brush, they saw 5 of them. 2 older women moving quickly, 3 younger women just behind them, all barefoot. The women turned once. Perhaps they heard a branch snap. Perhaps the wind told them something was wrong. Their pace quickened. One of the older children looked back. Then came the crack. Little Sue, one of the Arikara scouts, later said he fired twice. He said it without shame. He said it like a boast. The first shot hit the taller woman in the back. She stumbled, then fell face first into the grass. The second struck an adolescent girl in the side. The others screamed and tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The enemy scouts rose from the reeds and came forward, fast now, rifles up, blades drawn. No mercy, no warning. It was not a fight. It was slaughter. They cut them down near the water, where the reeds grow thick and green, shot them, stabbed them, left them where they dropped. One of the younger women was struck with the butt of a rifle so hard it broke the stock. The water, which had been clear, ran red for a moment, then stilled again, as if nothing had happened. Those women who fell that day were Gall's family, 2 of his wives, 3 of his children. Their names are not spoken now, but they lived, they laughed, they sang, they were loved. Did Bloody Knife know who they were? Some say no, but I do not believe that. A man like him, he knew what pain he was planting. He knew whose heart he was cutting. Gall did not see those bullets fall. He was away from the teepees, near the grazing lands where the pony herd stretched like wind-blown grass across the benches north of the Hunkpapa camp. It was the sound that reached him first, not the dry crack of the Springfield rifles, but the high, sharp cries of children, boys' voices, shrill with fear, rising like birds, flushed from the brush. Then came the thunder. From the muzzles of long rifles, wahiela, the single shotguns that spat lead and smoke into skin and canvas alike. He froze for the briefest breath, the world narrowing to a terrible stillness, and then he ran. As he moved toward camp, the gunfire thickened, rolling like drum beats across the greasy grass. Dust lifted above the teepees. Horses screamed. Voices, women, elders, rose in panic. Gall pushed through them, searching, but there was no order to what he saw. Just chaos. People running north toward the other tribal circles, some clutching bundles, some with nothing at all. He called out. No answer. He looked for the faces he knew best, for the shape of his wives, the small forms of his children, but they were not among the fleeing. In that first choking moment, he did not know. He thought perhaps they had escaped ahead of him, lost in the panicked flight toward the brûlée or the mini-conjou circles downstream. There was no time to find out. The attack had begun, and he had to move. His warrior's mind took hold. If his family had survived, it would be because the soldiers had not yet reached them. If they had not survived. He could not think on that, not then. Action was the only answer. His horses were still on the benches. Without them, he was a man with only rage and no teeth. So he turned north, running hard across the camp's edge, past the northern Cheyenne, toward the herds. Gunfire still cracked behind him. He could hear whoops and war cries now, ours and theirs. The scent of smoke was in the air, thick with burning lodge canvas and blood. Somewhere in that madness, his name might have been called, but he did not hear it. At the edge of the herd, he found his mount, sweat dark and wide-eyed. He gathered the reins, swung up, and turned back south. The rifle across his back felt heavier than usual. He looked once toward the place where the river ran wide and slow, where the women sometimes went to gather water. But the trees there were quiet now, still in a way that spoke of nothing alive. As he rode, the battle roared ahead of him. He saw flashes of movement through the timber, scouts, soldiers, horses breaking through brush. And with that came the grim certainty. He had not missed the fight. It was still unfolding. There was still time to strike. So he rode hard, circling down and around the lower edge of the village, hoping to cut off the escape route across the Little Bighorn. He did not yet know what the scouts had done down by the reeds. He did not know whose bodies lay cooling in the mud. But I believe something inside him already did. He circled wide, moving like a wolf along the outer rim of the village. The battle behind him was still alive. He could hear it. Reno's troopers had crossed the Greasy Grass in a rush, striking at the southern edge of the Hunkpapa and Blackfoot camps, driving hard. But they had not expected the resistance that rose like fire. Warriors poured from every direction. The earth itself seemed to shake with hoofbeats and fury. Gall, riding fast with his horses now gathered, was set on cutting off their escape. But then something shifted. There was a change in the shouting, a pull in the air like the wind turning before a storm. Word reached him. Reno's men were retreating, broken and confused, scattering back into the timber and across the river, leaving dead and dying behind them. It should have been a victory, a cry of triumph. But Gall did not feel triumph, not yet, not with the weight in his chest growing heavier. And then came worse news. More soldiers were seen to the north, another column, more bluecoats, more danger. The downstream tribal circles, Cheyenne, Oglala, Brule, could be caught unaware. Gall's blood pounded. He was a Hunkpapa, but in that moment, he was more. The lives of many now depended on what he did next. He turned his horse once more and rode hard toward the timber near his own camp, toward the place where the attack had first struck. He had to find his family. He moved through the Hunkpapa circle like a ghost, searching. The camp was torn and shattered. Teepees had been trampled, burned, split with bullets. Women wept over still bodies. Dogs nosed at the blood. He called their names, his wives, his children, but only silence answered. He went to the river, where the reeds stood high and green, where the scouts had first come through like snakes. And there he found them. 2 women, 3 children. The water ran around their limbs, brown with mud, with blood. One of the women lay on her side, as if still shielding her child in death. The little one's arm was thrown across her belly. Flies had already come. He stepped closer, the world narrowing to a slow, ringing stillness. He knew each of their faces. He knew how their laughter had sounded just the day before. Now, their mouths were open to the sky, and no breath would ever rise again. He dropped to his knees. The wind was low and hot, the kind that stings the eyes. He sat there for a long time, his hands on their hair, his breath shuddering. When at last he rose, his face was changed. The grief did not fall from him. It settled in, deep, heavy, cold. He looked back at the river, at the cottonwoods, at the reeds. He thought of the scouts who had crept through them. Arikara, Crow, Bloody Knife. The same bloody knife he had hated since his youth. Gall stood over his family and felt his heart twist. Later, he would say it, that his heart turned bad inside him. I believe that. What lived in him after that was not the man he had been. It was something else, something made of a kind of beast that roared from within. He mounted his horse without a word, just fury and the weight of 5 names heavy as a stone in his chest. Then he turned north, where the new threat waited. His heart was full of grief, and with that grief came fire. He would carry both into battle. My bones ache in the cold, and when I tell of these stories, my dreams are filled with visions of that day. We tell the young that bravery is standing tall in the face of death. But Gall taught me it is something more. It is standing after your heart has fallen, after everything has been taken from you. It is riding into battle with the names of your children in your mouth to make them live again through the force of your fury. That is how I remember Gall on that day, not only for what he did, but for what he lost. Hetzelena, oyate, kin, nipikte, so that the people may live.
And that brings us to the end of this episode on the life of Gall. What you've heard today is drawn from historical records, eyewitness accounts, and the memory carried through generations. But to bring that history to life, we've taken certain liberties with structure and pacing. Our aim has always been to honor the truth, not just the facts, but the feeling. Because these aren't just stories from the past. They're echoes of real lives, real choices, and real consequences. If this episode resonated with you, consider leaving a rating or review wherever you're listening. It helps others discover these voices from the Old West and helps us keep telling them. You've been listening to Chronicles of the Old West. In our next episode, we ride into the heart of the Battle of the Little Bighorn through the eyes of Gall, who had already lost everything. This is not just the story of a battle. It's the story of a man forged in grief, who turned sorrow into strategy and loss into legend. We look forward to you joining us next time for Episode 5 in our series on Gall, Lakota War Chief.